Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Amelia Reimer, and I'm a proud Métis woman. There are many teachings about traditional Indigenous introductions. One such teaching that I embrace is to acknowledge my grandparents, Ralph and Mary of southern Manitoba, and Ed and Gertrude of the Nez Perce Reserve in Idaho. Another traditional teaching is to announce to which clan you belong, but I can't tell you that, as that is the type of knowledge that was intentionally taken from my great-grandfather's side in Montana and Alberta. I am also the proud mother of 2 grown sons who are members of the Raven clan of the Makah tribe through their father. I work here in St. John's at the Native Friendship Center as a cultural support worker. Emma, who will be up in a moment, is our president of the board of directors. As Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge, consult, and respect elders. It is also important, though, that the younger generations make that link and absorb as much of that knowledge as possible, as they will one day take their place in our communities as elders. This event tonight is about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirits in Canada. This is a subject that is difficult and painful to truly address and can be extremely triggering to the victims' loved ones. On the other hand, this is a topic that is now frequently featured in the news, the mainstream media. I would like to invite Emma Relis, Inuit Elder, to honor us with an opening prayer.
Thank you, Amelia, and welcome everybody here tonight. Before I start my prayer, I'd like to make acknowledgement that it is important to acknowledge that we are on meeting on traditional Mi'kmaq and Beothuk territory, and then we also acknowledge and remember our Innu and Inuit brothers and sisters in Labrador. So let us pray. Creator, I pray today for spirituality, truth, respect, wisdom, and belief, which comes from inside of each person. The Creator made us all different in one way or another, that being a transgender or two-spirited people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Respect becomes a balance. Respect becomes trust. We have to do our part too, no matter what our race or color. The Creator gives us grace and strength so that we can live in unity. We can never say too many prayers in this world with so much violence and no respect for anybody's lives. Sometimes people hurt the people they love. We can all live in a house, but the Creator would love for us all to live in a home. Amen. Thank you.
And I would also like to invite Wanda Whitebird, Mi'kmaq Elder, to give us another prayer.
There's a hand mic that Samantha had. So you guys can sit down if you like. It's all good. I'm like, so bonjour. Nani mere nagakweni dishnikas makwadadem. My name is Dancing Star. I come from the Bear Clan. I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, and the territory I come from is a little place called Opaskwayak, which is, I say this because I live in Ontario, so I say it's about 19 miles outside Antigonish, Nova Scotia. And then I had to ask people in Ontario, has anybody ever heard of it? And so I now live and work in the territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit, which what we call today is Toronto or T-Dot. Or what? Or the 6, the 4-6 or something now? Oh, just the 6. Geez, you got to keep up. It's so hard. And I'm so really excited to be home, you know, in Mi'kmaq territory. And I actually am going home tomorrow for sure because I'm flying to Halifax. And like, are we done now? Can I go? No, just kidding. And so I'd like to say thanks to Emma for opening us with that great prayer. When we light a smudge, it's about letting our ancestors know that we're starting something important and that we acknowledge them, that we recognize that we are on the land and the territory, we're on stolen land, that this land was full of life and amazing people before it was settled by the settlers. But it also lets us know that we're about to begin something important, and that we ask for that clarity of mind to think good things, to see and hear and smell and say good things, have good things in our hearts, and walk in a good way. And so Reader's Digest version is this. And so if you were wondering what we were doing at the front, that's what we were doing. You know, we were acknowledging our ancestors. We were asking for the clarity of mind to remember the words that we hear. We ask the Creator to put kind words in our mouth, that we're not saying those things that are going to hurt anybody. And if we do, we really hope that if it's something that's been said that hurts you, please come and tell us that it's something that we've said, because that's how we learn how to change the things we say. Because sometimes we don't know that. We come from different places and different spaces. You know, so we ask that we walk in a good way. And we usually start with a song, and I know Emily brought a drum. I'm like, okay, hand mic, a drum, and a stick. I don't know how that works. Okay, you do the mic. That'd be good. But I need it first. So this song that I've been in my heart all day is the bear song that I learned at home here in these territories from Maggie Paul. And I sing it with the young people that I work with. I mean, really young, like, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and in a sweat lodge. And so it's the bear song, and I say it talks about, how bear sounds in the woods, and then it's about how we run away. No, and it gets faster and faster because, that's what's going to happen, right? Because you're going to run. So, they have a really fun time with this, and it only has one line. So, I offer this up for all of us. I offer this song up in hopes that our words tonight are heard in the way that they've been said, that our message gets out not just here, but that you take it with you wherever you go. And I hear we're on the internet, and I'm like, what does that mean? So we know somebody in Australia could be looking at us right now. Is that how that live stream works? Oh, no wonder everybody's so nervous. Oh, no. But so if you're hearing us out there in the internet world, wherever you may be, that these words are said in love, hope, and honesty, that our stories get out there, and that our women are not targets within their communities, and our Indigenous women all over the world are loved and respected for who they are. So, okay, the bear song. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, away, hi-ya, hey-yo. Away, 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 hi-ya, hey-yo. So that's the bear song. And Miigwech, Island, you kind of get out all my relations, and we can move on to the next topic. Right? Are we ready? Okay. We're good. Oh, I gotta back up. Watch your toes.
Well, Alan, thank you, Manda. Next, I'd like to invite Carolyn Darkangelis from the Memorial University Gender Studies program.
Hi. You're gonna make me cry. I'm so happy you could all come here, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank the people that worked hard to put this together. First, my co-organizers, No More Silence, and the St. John's Native Friendship Center. And then, you know, financial support is always needed for these. So a big shout out to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, your tax dollars at work, fondly known as SHRC. Okay, so also we got funding from several groups within Memorial University, so the General Conference Fund, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences Conference Fund, and the Department of Gender Studies. And finally, in terms of funding, we received funding from the Groundswell Community Justice Fund in Ontario. I wanted to just thank a few more individuals. Well, Kevin O'Leary and the DELTS team, they did an amazing job with the setup, and hopefully it'll all run smoothly. Thanks to Janet Heron, who's a communications coordinator here in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And for graduate students who are here, Kim Wakeford, Sam Bokma, Elise Stewart, and Leslie Butler. Thank you so much. They ran around and put up all the signs. And finally, she's not here, but the Gender Studies Administrator, Joan Butler, is really a huge thanks to her, because she, you know, waded through the bureaucratic things that have to happen to get people paid. So thank you very much.
So this is the 4th annual Violence No More event. And this is the first time, actually, that it's been held outside of Toronto. Here on the island of Newfoundland, we find ourselves at ground zero for colonization and colonialism. Even the Mayflower stopped here for supplies on the way to Plymouth Rock. Violence No More is a collaborative effort between No More Silence, the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and Families of Sisters in Spirit. This year's event is also a collaboration with Memorial University and the St. John's Native Friendship Center. Tonight is a discussion on how to hold the government accountable in its upcoming inquiry process, as well as our ongoing efforts to strengthen community-based responses to violence against Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirits. Our panelists tonight are Charlotte Wolfrey, Nunatsiavut Inuk from Rigolet, and an anti-violence advocate. Barbara Barker, Qalipu and Mi'kmaq Mi'kmaq ancestry, and practicing attorney in St. John's. Dr. Alex Wilson, Opaskwayak Cree, an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. And Dr. Kim Stanton, settler ally and legal director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. And I'll give you a more in-depth introduction to each of them soon. Locally, missing and murdered Indigenous women and children currently comprise 24% of all cases in a population that province-wide only claims to be 7% Indigenous. Out of these cases identified as Indigenous, 61% are Inuit, 30% are Mi'kmaq, and 9% are Innu. We believe there are many more cases out there that have not yet been brought forward for our attention to be included in the database for Newfoundland and Labrador, cared for and maintained by the St. John's Native Friendship Center. There's still so much more research to be done and the acknowledgement of the lives lost. There's so much more to each individual case than just the statistical data. A family and community affected, the larger social consciousness altered. To gain perspective into the modern situation of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the past cannot be ignored. The legacy of colonialism, enfranchisement, the pass system, Indian residential schools, the 60s scoop, and more, all leads to what we see today. Only recently has the national crisis finally been recognized and a formal inquiry to be conducted into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Did you know that in the year 1500, Christopher Columbus wrote that the price they could get for selling land for farming was also about the same price they could get for selling an Indigenous woman to a European man? That in fact, at that time, the best price and the most in demand were girls as young as 9 or 10. Girls that today we would think of as grade 4 and 5 were the most highly sought after for sexualization and exploitation. If they ended up missing or murdered, it wouldn't have mattered, as another could be bought to take her place, treating human beings as disposable commodities. Colonialism is a big buzzword these days, but what does it really mean? It's a mindset and a legacy that is alive and well in this country. It is literally defined as control by one country over another area and its people. It's all about control. Another fact that keeps coming up again and again is that Indigenous cases are so very often under-investigated and under-prosecuted. How much higher would the statistics be of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children if it were to be done properly? Questionable cases include those taken to remote locations and left to die of exposure, deaths that are far too often dismissed as suicides, blunders with evidence that becomes inadmissible, and more. Have you ever heard of a case of a non-Indigenous baby's brain being lost as evidence, thrown out with medical waste? Again, a strong undercurrent giving us the message that Indigenous peoples are not viewed as fully human and not deserving of respect or the sacredness of life. At this point, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Charlotte Wolfrey. Charlotte is well known throughout Nunatsiavut, the province, and Canada for her work in advocacy for the rights of women and children and for her dedication to speaking against family violence. She is one of the main creators of the Daughters of Mikak project and sits on the advisory committee as the representative from Rigolet. Formerly the Status of Women Coordinator for the Nunatsiavut government, she has worked in senior management positions in healthcare and municipal administration. Charlotte served for many years on the Rigolet Inuit Community Government, the Labrador Inuit Association, and as mayor for Rigolet. She has served on regional, provincial, national, and international committees, including Canadian Inuit Circumpolar Health Society, Atlantic Aboriginal Health Research, Puktutut Inuit Women of Canada, Provincial Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and many local and regional groups and organizations. Charlotte is a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for her work in advocacy against violence and is most proud of being a wife, a mom for her 4 children, and a grandmother.
Thank you. I made a mistake. It's Angayukak, which is the Inuktitut word for mayor, when she couldn't pronounce it. So, Unukut Ilunasi, Charlotte Wolfrey Uvunga. Good evening, everyone. I'm Charlotte Wolfrey, Rigolet Uvunga, and I'm from Rigolet in Nunatsiavut. Rigolet is actually the southernmost Inuit community in the Nunatsiavut land claim area. It's 10 years, the Nunatsiavut is 10 years old. And I'm here today to tell you about a journey in my life that I was forced to take. However, I wished and am still wishing that I never had to go there. I want to begin by acknowledging the support, love, and help that I received along this journey that I've been on. I first and foremost need to acknowledge my immediate family, David, my husband, and my children, because they experienced the brunt of my pain. They saw me at my worst times and stood by me and supported me all the way. And our extended family members and my community. And even our health authority, that was Labrador Inuit Health Commission at the time, but they're now called the Nunatsiavut Government, Department of Health and Social Development. I'm sure that they made support groups just for me. And people came from all over Newfoundland, Labrador, and indeed Canada to support me and hug me and care for me. Everywhere I went, I met people who reached out to tell me it was good to see me. Ilitanami, it's good to see you. People who encouraged me to keep on working. And I can't start to name any of those people at the risk of leaving someone out. But they know who they are, you know who you are, you know what you did, and I thank you. So my story starts on January 20th, 1993. It was an ordinary day. I was in Goose Bay. I traveled a lot in my job for work. And at 8:30 in the evening, I got a call that changed the course of my life forever. I was told that my beautiful daughter, Deirdre Marie Michelin, who's up there on the screen, was dead. Deirdre was just 15 days shy of her 21st birthday the night that she was murdered. And she was preparing to leave a violent relationship that she had silently endured. Deirdre had 4 children. She was feisty, humorous, caring, and generous. And her children were really her life. She loved them dearly. Dee Dee was shot. We called her Dee Dee by her partner, who then turned the gun on himself, and their 4 children were in the house when all of this happened. So as you can imagine, we as a family had a lot of work to do to see her children were taken care of. And they ranged in age from 13 months to 5 years. And we wanted to ensure that their lives would be the best that they could be. And at that time in 1993, there were 3 communities in what was then northern Labrador without a permanent police presence. The police had to fly in from Goose Bay. And on the day she died, Deirdre had actually called the RCMP for help. She knew she was going to die. However, the RCMP said that unless and until her partner did something, there was nothing that they could do. She knew she was going to die, and there was no protection services for her. And if the police did come to her aid, they would have taken hours to get there from Goose Bay. So at that time, immediate help was really out of the question. But I'm waiting for the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women to tell all of my story. But I was thrown into a sea of turmoil and pain, and I had to somehow, some way, try to find peace and acceptance. So I threw my energy into fighting to try and get a permanent police station into 3 northern communities that didn't have police. I wanted other women to be able to get the help that they needed in a timely manner and to have protection that is really our right under the Canadian Constitution. And for those of you who don't know, I guess I became advocate extraordinaire. I always spoke out about violence against women and children, and I tried to bring attention to a taboo subject, which, by the way, for the most part, is really still hidden in Nunatsiavut today. And I used the best gift that I had, the gift of gab, to channel my hurt, pain, and anger into trying to get us protection. And I used every opportunity that came to me to fight for justice, to give us rights to the safety of our being. That's what the Canadian Constitution says. You have a right to feel safe in your communities. And before Dee died, I was a mother with a big voice. But now I was a mother on a mission. And I learned all about the Canadian Constitution, like I said, our right to feel safe. And I used all the tools that I had to fight for other women's daughters. I knew my daughter was gone, and I didn't want any other mother to endure what I had endured. And I didn't want any other children to live through the horrific nightmare that my 4 grandchildren had to live through. Every meeting I attended, I spoke of the need for police in northern Labrador. I could be at a fisheries and oceans meeting, or a recreation meeting, or a meeting of all men where I knew some of them were violent. It didn't matter. I spoke of the need to end violence and to get our communities full-time policing. And it wasn't only me, it was me along with other Labrador women. We arranged and attended meetings with numerous ministers of justice, premiers, and others, both on a provincial and federal level. So finally, after 8 long years, we got police stationed in 2 of the 3 communities. And it was a bittersweet moment for me. It was a happy moment, and yet at the same time, I was so sad. Sad that my daughter had to die before we finally got what every other Canadian citizen takes for granted, safety. I remember sitting at my desk at work and wondering, what am I going to do now? This mission that had occupied my life is kind of over, and I was so scared. I didn't know why then I was scared, but I do now. I was scared because now I had to deal with and face, not on a level with my head anymore, but from my heart. I had to deal, with my pain and loss, and that is really when my healing journey started. When you have to deal with the guilt, the what-ifs, the whys, that's when the hard work begins. And I can't really say that I'm healed. I don't think the journey will ever end. And I will always accept that my life is complicated. There will always be hardships and pain, and that life is unpredictable. But I always try to remember that I am here for a reason. I remember that my life is safe. And as long as I can speak, I hope I can be a voice for those who are silenced. My motto was, and still is now, because I know no matter where I am or what is happening, I can go home to safety and feel love, and I feel that it's my responsibility to speak up for those who don't have that privilege. And in a message of hope to those who are in great pain, my humble advice would be to tell your story. Talk about your loss. This helps. I used every means I could. I went to counseling. I went to healers. I went to elders. I went to church. I spent a lot of time on the land because that's where I did most of my healing, was on the land. But whatever is good for you, do it. And I am encouraged by the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I hope this inquiry will lead to better lives for Inuit women and children, and actually for all Inuit. So here are some of my thoughts on what I want to come out of the inquiry. First and foremost, I want to ensure that there is a good support service set up for those families who want to participate and tell their stories. This support will need to continue because most of the communities in the north don't have good mental health services. So after the inquiry is over, there will still need to be support services. Because this inquiry will open up deep, deep hurt and pain. Emotions will be raw and supports will be necessary. And I know this because during the pre-consultations, I felt it. And the best way I can describe it is this. I had things tucked away. I had my heart sewn up, stitched up and patched. And during the pre-consultations, those stitches were slowly being cut open and the pain and hurt exposed. And I went back to the moment when I first heard that my daughter was killed. However, the protection system that I had then is not there now. The numbness that sets in, that helps you through it, is no longer there. Now it's just raw pain. And so it's for that reason that I cannot stress enough that supports are really necessary. And for me, I'm talking about my daughter dying 23 years ago. And I really had lots of love and support. And not everybody has that. And we will need to take care of people. I want this inquiry to give families a chance to tell their story. This means coming to smaller communities and to provide services in Inuktitut for those whose first language is not English. And for Inuit and Inuit communities, family or domestic violence is really what's most prevalent. And so I hope we will get services such as safe shelters, because over 70% of the communities in the north don't have safe shelters. And our communities in the north are not funded with federal dollars for capital infrastructure. Canada funds Indigenous communities differently. And I hope this will be a recommendation to treat all Indigenous communities the same. It's a really long story. I don't want to go into it. But I hope it will get addressed through this inquiry. I also feel that the inquiry is happening. While the inquiry is happening, there should be some other, I'm talking in the north, research to see what services are lacking, and that the inquiry and the research could really complement each other. I have hope that this inquiry will bring the issue of violence against women, against Inuit and other Indigenous women to the forefront, and to give the Canadian public the truth about what is happening, or in some cases, what is not happening when it comes to justice for our women and girls. The justice system in the north is what can be best described as an injustice system. And I sincerely hope that this gets looked at. Things like, what services are there really for the victim? What services are there for the offenders? Do they ever get help? What help is there for families to heal together? And the length of time that it takes to put a case through the court system, the number of postponements, the use of the Gledju principle when services to use this principle are not a reality in the north. Again, this is complicated. I don't want to go into it, and I'm sure it will become part of the questions of the inquiry, and I hope that it does. I want the inquiry to have teeth to ensure that the recommendations are followed up on, to ensure that the report is not put on some shelf and gathers dust. I want the inquiry to be binding on the government to ensure action. But how do the recommendations become a reality? That's going to be the question. And to be honest, I am looking forward to this inquiry with much expectations. I am hoping that this inquiry does for the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did for the victims of residential schools. I live with hope that we are not let down. Nakamik, thank you very much for listening to me.
Nakamik, thank you. Oh, you're good. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Next, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Barbara Barker. Barbara's father's mother's family are the Johns from Conn River, Mi'kmaq Mi'kmaq. She is a former board member of the Native Men's Residence and Native Women's Resource Centre in Toronto and the West Coast Women's Legal Education and Action Fund in Vancouver. She was president of the board for Northern Society for Domestic Peace, which supported the Highway of Tears initiatives in northern BC. Through Ending Violence Association of BC, she worked with Bev Jacobs, formerly president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, who's here with us tonight, on the Indigenous Community Safety Project. Since moving home to Newfoundland, she has worked with the Newfoundland and Labrador Legal Aid Commission.
Good evening, everyone. So, as Amelia said, I'm a part of the Qalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation. We're the new band here in Canada. We're a new creation. Amongst ourselves, we make a lot of jokes. We're a bunch of landless Indians, and that's a pretty big contradiction. Indigenous identity is really wrapped up in our land, who we are as a people. And my own grandmother's obituary, which is where my bloodline comes from. She was a very, very strong feminist. She definitely is the matriarch in our family. But her obituary, even though it talked about this beautiful sense of geography that she had, the understanding of the landscapes and the names, folk medicine, different kind of poultices that she would use traditionally, there was no mention of her as an Indigenous woman. Those things, even in her death, were erased. And I think that's a lived reality of being an Indigenous person in Canada. And I remember when Loretta Saunders died, some of the narratives, when Loretta was murdered, to be more frank. Around me, here in our own province, I heard that same erasure. Somehow, people in Loretta's death wanting to disassociate her from her indigeneity. She didn't look Indigenous. And so, I come to this space. I went to the University of Saskatchewan because I wanted to be a part of social change when it came to women and girls, women and Indigenous girls, and I didn't know how to do it. So I thought, I better go learn about the legal system as a starting point. And so off to Saskatchewan I went. And it was a formidable experience. I was very happy on my time on the prairies, but my first kind of exposure to the legal system, I guess, was that the University of Saskatchewan was the only university in Canada that didn't have a legal clinic. And it was just so odd. Out in the middle of the prairies where there was very clear kind of chasms between the Indigenous community and the settler community. Like in Saskatchewan, the Indigenous community lives on one side of the river in Saskatoon, and the settler community where the university is on the other side. And so that separation was just kind of, brought home with all of us kids at school, learning how to become lawyers, and the kind of essence of people who are maybe going to go on and never have any experiences in the community really needed to be grounded in your understanding that legal work is about access to justice. And if you don't get that in the beginning and you go on to do other things, you're never really going to understand what the point of what you're doing is. So a bunch of other students and I kind of got really bad marks in our first year, but we managed to pull together the resources, and there is a legal clinic there now. But it wasn't done because of anything to do with us at the university. It was the partnerships we had with the Indigenous community in Saskatchewan. Particularly, the clinic still operates out of the White Buffalo Youth Lodge in Saskatoon. And so, I continued on and did lots of other work from there, but as the touching point for the inquiry, my hope is that the community is able to really lead this process. Because families and the community, the Indigenous community, has been doing this work for a really long time. In Vancouver, there's a memorial march every February the 14th. And if my memory serves correct, I believe it was 1991 when that started, when voices on the downtown east side started saying, something's not right here, and wanting to feel power, feel empowered with the support of the community, but also to shout and bring attention to something that, without the work of the grassroots, we probably would never be in this point in this room saying, we're having an inquiry and, commissioners are appointed and structures are in place, but people need to know that it's the grassroots, it's families, it's survivors who have done that work. And I really hope that that intelligence, that insight, how carefully one must tread into those discussions is really respected in the process. And so I had a very busy week, and so if I'd thought a little more, I would have had the terms of reference of the inquiry available for all of us to look at. But I don't. I just have them here in front of me. And so I won't read through it all, but the inquiry has a mandate. And the kind of twofold mandate the commissioners are supposed to inquire into and report on are the systemic causes of all forms of violence, including sexual violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada, including underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, historical causes contributing to the ongoing violence and particular vulnerabilities of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And then twofold, the institutional policies and practices implemented in response to violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls in Canada, including the identification and examination of practices that have been effective in reducing violence and increasing safety. And so, we're a federal state, and this is done by the federal government. And that all sounds good. I'll be frank, it sounds good. But the problem is, provincial governments have their own policing authorities, municipal governments have their own policing authorities. Child, Youth, and Family Services is all, when it's not on the reserve, handled by the provinces. And so these terms of reference don't in any way bind the provinces to participate in that process. It doesn't mandate them to turn over documentary evidence, even anything that could inform the process. So policies that are working at a provincial level. So if that information is not available as a part of the full discussion, we're not really able to have a full discussion. And so that's a reaction I had right away when I heard about the federal government making the announcement. I hope that as we get closer to that start date in September, we'll see not just promises, actual acts that are going to, have the provinces and the territories saying they're on board for this and they're going to be a part of it in whatever way they can in terms of offering information, but then being a part of implementation. So, the whole point of this is to have families be able to talk about their experiences and to have that kind of explored through, socio-economic, legal kind of lenses. But there was, Charlotte made a reference, she didn't want this to sit, with dust on the shelf. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is a beautiful document. Some 5 huge bound publications. And a lot of work went into it. And you can just open up anywhere in that document and you can find a lot of the answers that we're looking for. So implementation is really all I can think about. Looking at the terms of reference again. There's another section, and maybe I'll go on memory. I have so many pieces of paper. Talks about supports that are available during the process. It says that explicitly. Supports available during the process. And that's really not good enough. I know I did work as a part of the Indian residential school settlement. When my work in British Columbia, I worked with individuals who were a part of something called the independent assessment process. And that was when individuals, beyond their common experience payment, went before a process of having the opportunity to tell their story of what happened to them. And there was supports available in the process, and there was $10,000 to $15,000 available for psychiatric or psychological services. But that was only if you made a particular legal argument. It wasn't available to everyone in that process. And I think it's unfair and dangerous to really start a discussion that you're not willing to finish. And I don't want communities and families to be left with a lot of pain. The research I did looking at the adjudication process is something that's been interesting to me because we're now looking at follow-up on that, where there's research available to see, what was that experience like for people to go through the common experience, but also the individual process. And a lot of the people who were interviewed 6 months after they had received payment said, oh yeah, the money's good, it's helped. And then they did follow-up another 6 months after that. That wasn't the information that was coming back. A lot of people said that, it was equally bad and good. They were able to recognize the positives as a part of the process. But a number of people indicated that it brought up a lot of pain and the resources really weren't there to deal with it. The things that were identified as positive were community members and community organizations that were available through the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And outside of it, pre-existing work. And that's the way it's got to be. It's not really going to work any other way. But everyone in this room may be aware there's no longer any money for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Its mandate was concluded. And as Charlotte said, healing is a lifelong journey. And bureaucracy is such a difficult space to negotiate. Mandates are finished. It's not how real people talk. And so I have, optimism, I have hope When it comes to the inquiry, I'm not someone who's experienced the loss personally. And, I just hope that those that have, and those who have been working on the front lines with families for all of these years, that they are an integral part of this process. And that the wisdom of the work that has been done, that is being done, and that will continue to be done, no matter what happens here. I've heard comments like, this is the government's inquiry. This is not the people's inquiry. And I still have hope that there is transformation available during the process, that it can become more of the people's inquiry. Things are very organic, and stories have a lot of power. And so we can be transformed in that very space. It is possible. But I am hoping that the paper, this terms of reference, that the inquiry is more than that. Because there are problems with the terms of reference. I've read a couple of them out. Another one, if I could find the order of my papers. Yeah, the inquiry, it says, authorize the commissioners to refer the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and survivors of violence against Indigenous women and girls who contact the Commission for information and assistance with respect to matters such as ongoing or past investigations, prosecutions, or inquests to the appropriate provincial or territorial authority that is responsible for the provision of victim services. That doesn't make any sense. Largely, this inquiry has been fought for because when families experience this loss, they were told by the quote-unquote appropriate provincial or territorial authorities, don't worry about it. She's out partying. She'll come home. Investigations didn't happen. When it was obvious, even at the scene of crimes, things were reinterpreted, ignored. And it's unfair to send families back to those police. And it's not good enough. And it doesn't make any sense to me that the police conduct that's at the core of some of the problems that have gone on here. And it's not just failures to investigate. The police have been the people perpetuating violence. They have been the actors. It's not fair to the families to say that we're not going to reopen cases that are part of the inquiry. That's got to be a part of the full narrative. Or, I have fears we're going to end up with something else to sit on the shelf. But I don't have fear that social change won't happen, because independent of any inquiry, I know the women, the people at the grassroots doing the work. And they'll keep championing, and they'll keep, with their loud voices, saying all the things people don't want to hear. Charlotte told me a very funny story earlier about telling, I believe it was Clyde Wells, about her constitutional right to feel safe in her community. Boy, Clyde wasn't too interested. But that doesn't really matter, does it? Because we have to speak up against people who don't want to hear what we have to say. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that, and maybe some questions, we can take it from there. Thank you.
Well, Alan, thank you so much, Barbara. I forgot to mention earlier, we have people watching at home tonight on the live stream who may have Twitter. And so we've got a couple of hashtags. Hashtag MMIW for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And also hashtag Violence No More NL. All no spaces, all run together. Hashtag Violence No More NL. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Wilson. Alex Wilson is a Neanawag in Inawag from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. Did I get that right? Awesome. She is an associate professor and director of the Aboriginal Education Center at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on gender, sexuality, and the prevalence of violence against Indigenous peoples. She is passionate about empowering land-based education and the protection of land and water. Thank you.
Nancy and Tutumak, thanks for the invitation to be here, and it's really empowering to be around so many powerful women, Two-Spirit people here. So I'm going to talk about queering inquiry beyond the red dress and what that means, and you'll see up there on the picture is our students at home that are looking at pictographs, but not just looking at them, they're enjoying the land that that their ancestors lived on for tens of thousands of years. You're probably wondering what queering inquiry means, and I'll kind of get into that, but I wanted to start with this constellation, and I know each nation has a term for this in your own language, and in English, do any of you recognize it? Orion, yeah. So we've been having this meteor shower, and so people are really looking at the skies again. But for us as Cree people, a lot of our cosmology has to do with our connection to the wider universe. And so this constellation for us is Wisagajak, and Wisagajak is our trickster character. And so in that, in our story, which is an ongoing creation story, there's an acknowledgement of an energy that exists in the universe. And the term Wisagajak, the end is Achak, which means star, and Kitachak means your spirit. So there's an understanding that in each of us there's a link to this big energy. And in the middle part of the word Wisagajak is Sagihi, which means love. And so that's the anchoring of a natural law, Sagihiwewen, which means showing love in our actions. So this is the cosmology that allowed us not only to exist, but to thrive for tens of thousands of years on this land. So we've lived continuously as Indigenous folks on this continent longer than any other peoples on the planet, with the exception of our relatives in Australia. So this is a long, enduring spirit that allows us to be here today, and so I want to honor and recognize that. And so Wisagajak, the trickster character, is queer energy as well. And by queer, I don't mean just homosexual. I mean queer in the biggest sense, in that it's undoing all of all the Western concepts that create these binaries, the binaries that also create hierarchies that allow some bodies to be pushed down and make others supreme. And so just by saying the term Wisagajak, we're honoring that we can undo that, and just by returning to some of our traditional understandings, natural laws, and love is a big part of that. Using this iceberg analogy because we're here in Newfoundland, and they had us really working really hard in the workshop all day, so I didn't get a chance to really see these, but I hear they're out there. And some of you can verify that about 1/8 is above the water, 7/8 below. Is that correct from the locals? The proportion? Close enough, yeah. Okay. Well, it's good for purposes of this analogy. And culture is that way as well. And so the stuff that's above the water are the material aspects of any culture. And the stuff below the water are the enduring parts of the culture that change very slowly. All this, of course, is impacted by humans, climate change. But the things below the water are an indigenous worldview. And that's our philosophy, our understanding of our knowledge systems, cosmology, how we fit into the universe, and our understanding of that. Epistemology, which is our knowledge systems and science, ontology, what we know and understand to be truth. Methodology, how we go about things, how we find out new information, how we inquire. And pedagogy is how we teach. And all of this is connected to land. And so when we talk about queering inquiry, I'm talking about returning to this under the water part of what it means to be Indigenous peoples on the planet. And for a long time, the focus has been on the above the water part, and that's multiculturalism, basically. So we want to move beyond multiculturalism to a deeper understanding of our legitimate knowledge systems that we have as Indigenous people. And you can see that what's happened during the process of colonization is the top of the iceberg has become removed from the bottom part, and that's a disconnection. And now the stuff above the water becomes our definition of culture, or many people's definition of culture. And so I think as part of this inquiry, we are, it's framed within reconciliation. Is it trying to realign the bottom with the top, or is it returning to our underlying philosophies, worldviews, legitimate science and knowledge? And I would say it's the latter. Oh, is this going to work from here? Yeah. So I put a question mark there because I don't know if reconciliation is possible or if we want it. If we want to do the work of it, maybe that's for settlers to do, because we've been on the receiving end of unequal power balances and unequal power dynamics. And so this term here is really important. It's epistemicide. So we all know, we've heard of the cultural genocide, like the kind or gentle genocide, or really it's genocide. It's the killing of bodies. But along with that is also the severing of knowledge systems. And so that is really key. So that's what epistemicide is. So when Indigenous people are removed from their land, it's not just bodies that are being impacted, it's also our knowledge systems. So this is important within the bigger scheme of things. Because the effect of genocide and epistemicide has been asymmetrical, as Nan Simpson says. We all know what the effect is. That's the impact of colonization. It's been institutionalized, it's societal, it's cultural, it's interpersonal, and we know that in terms of racism, homophobia, misogyny, ableism, classism, and all those kind of forms of oppression. It's meant a disconnection from meaningful relationships, including to the land and the water, which allows for and actually promotes the destruction of land and water. And there was a really powerful statement from one of the elders from Mount Poly, where the imperial metals has polluted the water there. And the elder there said during the residential school era, the children were removed from the land, but today the land is removed from the children. So there's always a connection to land and resource extraction whenever we're talking about violence on Indigenous bodies. It is normalized, the effect is normalized violence, and violence becomes internalized. Language is lost or language is changed, and binary gender has been entrenched. Spirituality has now become religion. It's become institutionalized by schools, prison, CFS, healthcare, etc. So I would say it's not just the justice system that's implicated in this ongoing violence, the continuum of violence against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans people. that the education system is a big part of it. So I would think that when we're talking about an inquiry, in order to understand those intersecting forms of oppression, that we also have to look at everything that's implicated. And the effect of this also is that certain worldviews get privileged while others get dismissed. And it's usually Indigenous views that get dismissed. So the It Starts With Us campaign has a website, and many of you have been instrumental in starting this. It's a community-based database, community-driven database, and there are different sections to it, but I wanted to point out one section in particular, which is the community lists, and on this page are entries of Two-Spirit and trans people. And Two-Spirit and trans people have felt the impact in an asymmetrical way, as I said earlier, and their bodies have been impacted by colonialism in ways that others haven't. And so to keep Two-Spirit and trans people in the discussion, all discussions around murdered and missing Indigenous women is very important. And you'll see here there's entries of people who are still missing, Colton Pratt, and then others who have been murdered. And this is just, we just started entering these, and Jeffrey's here, he's a part of this database, helping with this database as well. And this isn't just an academic kind of exercise. If I look at that list, I know 3 of those people who were my friends. And I think that if we went around the room, probably all of you might know of a Two-Spirit or trans person that has been impacted by colonial violence, either murdered, missing, or has internalized it so that they no longer feel safe in the world and they commit suicide. We know for trans-identified Native youth, 60%, almost 60% have attempted suicide. So if you think about that, if you know a trans-identified Native person, chances are they have attempted suicide, or they will at some point attempt. So this stuff about the inquiry is really, it's about creating interventions as well. And part of understanding how to do interventions is to have an awareness of what's really happening out there too. Yeah, if we can go back to, and so there's that hashtag on there, and I'd ask and we'd request that if you're going to use the MMIW hashtag, that you also add girls and Two-Spirit people. And the Two-Spirit umbrella includes trans people. So it's a term that is a self-descriptor for gender and sexual diversity within an Indigenous understanding of who we are. So it's kind of returning to our traditional knowledge systems. And each territory might have their own understanding, but that's respecting that there is diversity even within our own communities. So really it does start with us. So I like the phrase that you use, the people's inquiry. And I think it can be a parallel process or it can be an intersecting process, but either way, we need to include all aspects of our community, especially those that are particularly impacted by the intersections of different forms of violence. This is a Prezi, by the way, it's public. You can get it online, and there's an anti-copyright on it. Take it, change it, share it. And so we're saying queering, inquiry, and now these came from a calls to action or a manifesto. Was kind of a public collaboration on Facebook. And then from there we talked to other people and they kind of made changes. So again, this is a living document. You can take this and you can add to it, you can change it. It's also aligned with this notion of reconciliation. What does that mean? And how does the inquiry fit, or how does it not fit within that? So some of the points are addressing the interconnections between misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, and racism. addressing the damage that lateral violence does to individuals and to communities. The third one could be a little bit controversial for some. Call out and name perpetrators, individuals, institutions, and corporations alike. So there's a corporate element. We're sitting in a university, and I'm not going to implicate any specific universities, but a lot of our institutions are paid for by resource extraction companies that are perpetrators of environmental damage and environmental racism, which impacts Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people in unequal ways. Name racism, sexism, classism in the larger community, the queer community. Name misogyny and homo-transphobia in Indigenous communities. So we have to also look how heteropatriarchy has impacted our own Indigenous communities and address that. And sometimes that can be really difficult to do. Stop celebrating allies, and there's many statues around of allies, and instead acknowledge the bodies and peoples who have been most impacted by colonial violence, and acknowledge Indigenous understandings of sexual and gender diversity. Address the connections between violence against bodies to violence against the land. And this is the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and they've done so much excellent work in this regard. But stop equating violence against physical bodies to resource extraction. When discussing, researching, teaching, writing about suicide prevention, include the impacts on Two-Spirit, queer, and trans people. Include Two-Spirit and trans people in any and every discussion about murdered and missing Indigenous women and the inquiry process. And I didn't see any mention in the terms of reference, if it's there, so I haven't seen it. And then celebrate fabulous queer youth and adults. And these are just some calls to action that some youth did, ages, I think the youngest was 9 or 10 and the oldest was 17. And they have a very sophisticated understanding and language. And I would say if you read some of these statements, if you don't understand the language, like some of it I didn't understand, you have to catch up to them, because this is how they're talking. And this is how they're describing their own body sovereignty and their own gender self-determination. And they're creating the hashtags too, smudge, don't judge, and make it happen. So some of the things on there that are, they're really, they're basic things, like ask a person what gender, what pronoun they prefer to use. That's such a simple thing, but that's undoing systemic violence just by taking that one step. So every single person in this room could do that from now on, and that would create a change. And so it doesn't have to cost $1 million, and it may be really uncomfortable. I know we had an exercise today where we're trying not to use pronouns at all, and it was really difficult. But we do know in our own languages, many of them, we don't have gendered pronouns. So again, we have this knowledge within our communities. We just need to kind of tap back into it and acknowledge it. And then this is the undoing or not undoing, it's beyond the red dress. And so this is another way that people are kind of doing their own interventions around a heteropatriarchal narrative. And so the red dress, many of you know the red dress is a symbol of missing and murdered Indigenous women, but some people are doing the red pantsuits. And it's an important intervention, because it's saying, that dress doesn't represent me or the people that I love that have been murdered or that are missing. And so why can't we use symbols or images that really have a deeper meaning for the community? And so this is a photo that Lynn Gale sent, and I know others have done this as well. So that's part of queering the inquiry, thinking of ways to kind of undo these binaries that have kind of kept us on a certain hierarchy and a path. And so I guess that kind of leads to where we are today, and thank you all for the opportunity to share this.
Hi. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Kim Stanton. She's the human rights lawyer and feminist advocate. Her legal practice has focused on constitutional and Aboriginal law. Her academic work has focused on truth commissions and public inquiries. She's the legal director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, a national equality rights organization.
Thank you very much. Amelia, that was a kind introduction, and thanks for the smudge earlier. And to the elders, thank you for your welcome and prayers, and to Carolyn and Audrey for including me in this gathering. I've been really honored to be in the room today with, as you said, all these powerful women who have been working for so long and fighting the good fight. And it's very, very humbling to be in your midst, so thank you for having me here. I think I was invited because LEAF, the organization that I work for, was one of the organizations that joined the Legal Strategy Coalition on Violence Against Indigenous Women when it started. It's an ad hoc coalition that was established in 2014 after Loretta Saunders was murdered. And we all got together to see how we as legal advocates could contribute to addressing this tragedy in our midst of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And so one of the things that we've been doing as a coalition has been to provide resources to communities that don't necessarily have access to legal advocates or resources. And so if you go to our website, leaf.ca, and look under the legal tab, you'll see there's a tab for the Legal Strategy Coalition. And under that, you'll find a lot of resources that we hope are helpful, including a set of FAQs on public inquiries to just help people understand in general what public inquiries are, what they can and can't do. There's also, we put out a statement calling for provincial and territorial cooperation in the national inquiry and how critical that is and why, and that's been touched on a bit earlier here as well. We've also done things like critique the RCMP reports on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and sort of show the ways in which the framing of the statistics that they use is perpetuating bias against Indigenous people and not particularly helpful. And we also put together a report in preparation for the roundtable that took place in February 2015 on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that report, we had absolutely extraordinary volunteers who went through 58 reports that have been done on various aspects of this situation, including the 40 that the then government relied upon to say that no national inquiry was required because all of these reports were already there, and what did we need an inquiry for? And what we determined was that out of those 58 reports, there were over 700 recommendations, almost none of which had ever been implemented. And so, from my perspective, we need a national inquiry, not to reinvent the wheel. We do actually, from all of those 58 reports, see that the root causes are quite generally agreed upon and quite well known. From my perspective, we need an inquiry to understand how it is that we as a society are willing to tolerate this enormity in our midst, and how it is that we as a society know what to do, and yet we do not do it. Why is it that we are so resistant to doing what we know needs to be done? And that, to me, gets at the very ugly truth in Canada, which we have this idea of ourselves as this human rights enforcing, very progressive country in the world, when we are in fact a deeply racist and deeply sexist society, and we're in complete denial about it. And this inquiry needs to crack that open and expose to ourselves non-Indigenous people, because Indigenous people are wearing the scars on their bodies. They know this all too well. It's our non-Indigenous selves that need to face the music here. So I think that the inquiry needs to take a look at that resistance to the truth, and it needs to also consolidate and update the existing knowledge that we have from the previous reports. My academic work is on truth commissions in established democracies. I was very struck when I worked overseas in the early 2000s in West Africa. I was an observer of a truth commission there, and I was struck by the fact that we in the West required countries in Africa and other places, Latin America, if they were going to benefit from our benevolence of money to help them transition from authoritarian to democratic rule, because we're so apparently knowledgeable, that they would be required to have a Western liberal style constitution, and they would be required to have a truth commission. And I just felt like it was the height of hypocrisy for, the United States that has never looked at slavery, and the fact that their country is grounded in a deep and abiding injustice, has never had a National Truth Commission to determine their own vast mass human rights abuse and how they can move forward from it, and yet require all of these other countries to do it. And so when I came back to do my graduate work, I realized that I wanted to look at the use of truth commissions in established democracies, and our truth commission was being negotiated at the time. And I thought, what do we do in Western democracies? We don't typically have truth commissions. I mean, the only reason we had one was because it was required of us to settle masses of class action lawsuits that were costing the government so much money that they decided, oh, we better settle this because it's costing us too much. We didn't have a truth commission because non-Indigenous Canadians all of a sudden woke up and said, oh my God, what are we doing here? We've been committing genocide for a century. We have to do something about it. It wasn't that. So what we do in Western democracies is we have public inquiries. That's what we do. Truth commissions start out from the assumption that there is a truth that needs to be addressed, and public inquiries start out from the assumption that there is something that we need to look into. And there may or may not be a truth, but a good inquiry will look at the truth and name it, and create an incontrovertible historical record so that nobody can say after that date, these things never happened here. And that's one of the things that an inquiry can do that's meaningful and important. There are two things that I think make an effective public inquiry, broadly speaking: leadership and process. And I think we saw in no uncertain terms in the Missing Women Inquiry in British Columbia how if there is a failure on those two fronts, there will be a train wreck of an inquiry. So we really need to not repeat that with this inquiry, and I think we can still be hopeful about this inquiry. It's not going to be perfect, no inquiry is, but I think that we still have the opportunity to have something useful come of this process. I believe that an inquiry, if it's properly run, can be a pedagogical process unto itself. It can be a national teach-in, essentially. If it's done that way, it can build social accountability. So if it involves the wider public, openly acknowledges the harm that's been done, fosters a sense of societal identification with the victims and the families, establishes that incontrovertible historical record that I mentioned, makes recommendations to prevent recurrence of the injustice, and creates knowledge and understanding through its very operations so that the result is being achieved even before the report is being written and the recommendations are being made. if you conduct it in a way that people feel that they've been heard, you can go a long way toward building the kind of social change that we need. The inquiry really, really needs to have a clear and effective media strategy from the outset. I can't stress that enough. It's so important because it needs to actually engage the broader community and not just the people who will already necessarily be called before it. It needs to hold public hearings that aren't lawyer-driven, and I can say that as a lawyer, it's very important. It needs to go to the communities and listen to the families in their first languages. It needs to hold different kinds of hearings as well, some institutional hearings to deal with the structural violence that is at the root of what we're talking about. Community hearings, so-called expert hearings, although it needs to be very clear that all the evidence that is heard by the inquiry will be valued. It needs to engage civil society and welcome independent research. And in these ways, it can build that social accountability that I was mentioning. So the process needs to build trust and engagement and social cohesion for communities that have been very disheartened by the justice system and the education system and the healthcare system and the legion of systems that are built in a colonial country. To create legitimacy in the broader community, because if you do that and you build public engagement, that translates into political will, such that a report won't end up on the shelf gathering dust. This inquiry is happening within this election cycle. And so those of us who care about the families and who care about our society being a more compassionate, less self-interested kind of place, need to shake off some of our apathy and make sure that this government understands that if it wants to be reelected, then it needs to agree to implement the recommendations that come out of this inquiry. And there's a couple of ways that I've seen that I think might be effective for ensuring some implementation. In Ghana, in West Africa, when I worked there, the Truth Commission that was operating there, in parallel to it, civil society in the country created a civil society coalition. So labor and religion and students and workers, you name it. There was a really wide-ranging civil society coalition formed to hold the inquiry accountable very publicly, but also to provide constructive criticism privately. They sent eminent emissaries to meet with the commissioners on a regular basis to tell them how the inquiry was playing out for their constituencies and in their communities, and to seek modifications to how the inquiry was running, so that how the Truth Commission there was running, so that the commissioners understood that they were being held accountable by the communities. And also the coalition members educated their own constituencies about the process of the inquiry as it went along, and did advice on outreach and so on. And it was a very effective mechanism to work alongside the inquiry, essentially, but to hold it to account. And that coalition could then be very important politically in terms of keeping the elected officials aware that there's engagement and that people care, and that it needs to be understood that this inquiry is being paid attention to, and there's political capital in what the elected officials do with the recommendations. Also, we saw after the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba, about 8 years after it wrapped up, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry Implementation Commission, which was tasked with ensuring implementation of the inquiry recommendations there. And it, I think, fell victim to a change in government, but that is something that civil society actors could call for from this government after the end of this public inquiry. I think it's really important to understand how public inquiries can shift a national narrative. And I talked about this a bit last night, and I just want to mention it again. The work that I did in my doctorate, I focused on the Canadian Truth Commission, but I also focused on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry that then Justice Tom Berger was the commissioner for in the 70s, looking at whether there should be a pipeline from the Beaufort Sea down to the American border through the Western Arctic. And in that commission, he went to every community in the Western Arctic and heard from everyone over the age of 15 who wanted to speak to him about whether that pipeline should be built. And in every single community that he went to, he heard about the residential schools because people believed that in order for there to be any discussion of a pipeline, there had to be a discussion about the land. And in order for there to be a discussion about the land, there needed to be Indigenous control over Indigenous education. And there is a paragraph in his report, Northern Frontier and Northern Homeland, which talks about the residential schools. And as far as I know, it's the earliest place that I've found any reference to the residential schools in an inquiry report. And 20 years after he reported, we had a chapter in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report on the residential schools calling for a public inquiry. And the residential schools became the largest sort of piece of the public face of RCAP. I mean, that process raised people's awareness about the fact that the residential schools had existed and still did up until 1996 when they reported. And then another decade passed and we had a whole truth commission on the residential schools, which has raised the consciousness again of Canadians in particular, non-Indigenous Canadians, because of course, again, Indigenous people here didn't need a whole truth commission to know what was going on, but the rest of us sure did, because we were just not opening our eyes and opening our ears. And so I believe that over the 40 years that since that paragraph appeared in Tom Berger's report, there has been a shift in the narrative in Canada and a shift in the understanding amongst non-Indigenous people about the residential schools. And when you have an inquiry, no one will be satisfied. We talked about this as well last night. No one will be satisfied with the inquiry. Everyone is going to be disappointed in one way or another. Oh, they didn't choose the right commissioners. Oh, the terms of reference aren't right. Oh, they're not doing this structure right. Oh, they're not, I mean, there will be complaints. It will fail in all kinds of ways. But in one way, there are two ways, in fact, that it won't fail. One, if they do create that incontrovertible historical record, nobody in Canada will ever be able to say these women and girls and two-spirited people were not murdered because they were murdered because they were Indigenous women and girls. That truth will be outed. And then that that the I don't know. I'll come back to it. But basically, non-Indigenous people need to take responsibility now for ensuring that this inquiry makes its way forward, that we do the best that we can with it, and that it will contribute to a change in the narrative in this country. Those RCAP recommendations, the Truth Commission recommendations, and in particular the TRC recommendations aren't something we need to wait around for the government to do. Those are things we all can be doing ourselves. Choose one, start on it. It's not something that we have to wait for somebody else to do. So I think, non-Indigenous people need to pick up and carry some of this burden that we've created here. It's our responsibility and we have to do it. So I just, I think I'll leave it at that, but I'm very grateful for the time you've taken to listen to us tonight and to include me in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Kim. So now is the question and answer period of our evening. And also, anyone who is watching at home, if you want to tweet questions, you certainly can. We'll have someone here read them out. We've got a couple of people going to be running around with microphones here. There's one of them. So we've heard a lot of information, and it represents coast to coast to coast. And I think it's a lot to digest. It's a lot to take in, but it's all very important. Do we have any people who are looking to ask questions? Do you have our first volunteer? Yep. And we'll get Danielle up there with the microphone.
My voice is really hoarse. I'm put in a situation with my mental health, and what I feel was witness intimidation that was caused to me because of who the people were who hurt me. Now, the thing about it is, the more that I tried to express myself to those that were working inside of government, the more it seemed that I was trying to say the same sentence with different words to get the same meaning across to the waste that was happening. All I was seeing were jobs that were being created that were taking away my power and re-victimizing me. Now, the thing about it is, I am white. Now, I'm not trying to say that, oh, wait a second, now that I am white, we need to start doing something. But the thing about it is, we have allowed things to happen to the First Nations to the point where it has pushed it through, and people have become desensitized to the fact that it's happening to them. Because we have put ourselves in a situation, as long as it's happening to Joe Blow, therefore I am safe. But it's not like that. We're all in this situation where this genocide, just because we are Canadian, does not mean that it will not or could not happen here. We are in a situation where in the First Nations communities all across Canada, there are different stories about the conditions of the home. But the thing about it is, what has happened to our skill set to the point that we can't build it as we go? It does not make any sense to me. We're all talking about all these inquiries, and she's saying that it shouldn't be lawyer-driven. And I don't think it should be lawyer-driven either, because the first thing I hear about an inquiry, and I don't know if it came from her or not, but the people that they do find out, once you give your story, you're giving away your power to ever be able to really do anything and get yourself justice, as those lawyers are actually creating jobs for themselves and opportunities to be able to take away that money, as they're making the laws perverse enough to be able to protect those that are actually harming us, rather than making sure that we are being protected.
That's a really great point, and I think there have been different eras of genocide throughout history, and we know that they've impacted different bodies in other ways. So, but right now we're talking about the context of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, and this inquiry that was announced recently. So a lot of people that have been doing this work for decades, we have an opportunity to kind of come together and see what they have to say about it and their advice. Thank you.
Oh, but I guess the question is, Justin Trudeau is going to be in town next week, and we have all of these particular action moments where all of this money is supposed to be coming down, where he's actually going to be getting budgeting. And then on the backs of the Aboriginal, it seems like there's many opportunities where such inquiries or other things that are going on within government are going to write a lot of contracts for those who have been taken away our money. So when it comes to this no more violence and all of these big move acts, I just don't understand why we're cut ourselves off from the fact that, I don't mean to be sounding like that opera guy, but white lives matter too. But the thing about it is, I think it's time that we start doing something.
Yeah. Was there an actual question in there? Yeah. There are some interesting points brought up, as Kim and Alex have noticed. And in lieu of any other questions right now, is there any comments that you have on these issues? Because we do hear, do we have a question over here? Beautiful. There we go.
What are some practical things that ordinary citizens can do to pressure the federal government for implementation and for provincial and local governments to cooperate in the procedures?
There we go.
I think here in Newfoundland, we need to go to our own government and ask them what are they doing to make sure that whatever needs to happen for this province to fully participate in the inquiry for it to happen.
I guess I'm trying to say, what can I do? What can I put on my to-do list that will help that process? I, as a citizen, I mean, do I align myself with a group that is doing something, or what practical things can I do to help this happen?
Absolutely, you can align yourself. You can find a community organization. You could just write a letter from yourself to your own member of the Legislative House of Assembly and say, this is something that matters to me as someone that lives here in this province. It's important to me. What are you going to do?
And definitely support the work of the organizations that have already been doing, support the work of all the organizations that have already been doing this work for a very long time, and particularly the community-led organizations. I think No More Silence, for example, I think Audrey's saying there's a PayPal account. You know, they do need donations. They, like hard, cold cash is always in good taste. In terms of supporting Indigenous women's organizations, I always tell people as well to educate themselves. So please do read the calls to action. Please do read the executive summary, at least on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, so that you know when people say white lives matter, that you can confront them with information about why, in fact, Indigenous lives need to matter too, because white lives have mattered all along. And it's really important as well to ensure that the Indigenous-led processes and Indigenous-led organizations are being able to lead the way and finding ways to support them, but also, as I was saying in my talk, form coalitions with civil society organizations, get together, set out meeting dates, and say, we are going to make a calendar of actions where we will call upon the provincial government and the federal government to be held to account.
Go.
Can you hear me? Do you think that rather than having a national inquiry with the commissioners traveling all over the country, that having local, smaller, mini inquiries would work better? Because it would take into account local protocols, local languages, the issues that are happening with the missing and murdered in those territories? Would that be more effective?
I think it could be, but I think we're going to have the same kinds of issues that are coming up, that the same groups are going to be systematically excluded. So, possibly.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask if, you know, in your interpretation of the terms of reference, this is for the whole panel, if there is room for the kind of civil society coalition that you referred to that worked well in, I forget which country.
Ghana.
Yeah, and where there were special emissaries who held the government to account during the process. I'm just wondering if there's, I'll repeat the question, space for that in the terms of reference.
So there are, in point 7, the commissioners are authorized to establish both regional advisory bodies composed of families to advise on regional matters. So there may be scope within that to hold regional specific hearings and processes, and I don't see why that isn't a possibility. I think it's really important for the commissioners to acknowledge that they have the opportunity to interpret the terms of reference. It would be good from my perspective for them to take the time to do a bit of inquiry consultation themselves with families about how they should interpret their terms of reference. I think that would be worthwhile at this stage and respectful, frankly. And they can also set up issue-specific advisory bodies. That's part of their terms of reference. So there's no reason why, again, they couldn't do that in a way that would be open to a civil society coalition. But I think regardless of what the inquiry does, civil society has a responsibility to do it all by ourselves. I mean, the labor movement has some money. You know, I know not a lot like they used to, but compared to grassroots organizations, they do. And if they are willing to partner up with grassroots organizations and religious organizations and whatever to create a coalition, it could be done. Sorry, I keep taking up so much space. I'm going to stop talking for a bit.
Do we have comments on that same question from anyone else?
No, I just add that the outline, the terms of reference also say that those issue-specific advisory bodies, that they can advise on regional matters themselves. So potentially you could have a number of different kind of parallel processes taking place. And I think that's the work that has to be done between now and then, is to take advantage. You know, the thing about the law is you can kind of interpret it whatever way you want, especially if you have the authority and the information behind to back up what you're saying. As our last panelist, you know, has a real body of information there. And so we need to rely on the information that we have and the work that's already been done. And I can't stress that enough, that what this inquiry really has to do is just sit there and listen. And I know that there was a pre-inquiry stage and there was lots of opportunity for listening there, and some of it happened successfully and some not so successfully. And I guess that's the essence of doing any kind of work that is with the state. You don't really have complete control over what's going on. But that doesn't mean that you have to give up your power. And I have so much faith in the people that have been doing this work for all of these years that I really do have hope that even if it's in our own communities, as we're watching what's going on, we're having our own dialogues, we're doing our own work every day. And so it may be informal in some ways, but I do think that there's the capacity to do that for sure.
Let's see, Audrey?
I guess I would just like to add to the question of what can be done concretely. There's other things too that sort of fly in the face of this government's pretension to want safety for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And those are things like going forward with the flooding of a huge valley that is going to drown agricultural land and traditional territories in northern BC. Where there's currently a court challenge to it, and they're still going forward. There is a petition that people can sign. Just Google Site C Dam. That is around Fort St. John. That's one of the areas with the highest rates right now of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So it's kind of a complete hypocrisy to be starting an inquiry while at the same time you're going ahead and going to worsen the situation for people on the ground. Also, you can ask the government to repeal Bill C-36, which reinstituted laws that were struck down as being unconstitutional because they make it unsafe for people to engage in sex work. You can't, like we can do this right now. This needs to happen right now. We don't need an inquiry for that. So those are some things. And I really was serious about giving money to It Starts With Us. Alex had put up one of the pages, and we have a page with our PayPal account. The money that we get, it goes directly to support families, for example, to help them travel to ceremony, to get support at their court appearances, possibly even to help with private investigators, because we know that so many have unsolved cases where the police simply don't do their job. And what we really hope for Violence No More 2017 is to have it in Little Buffalo, Northern Alberta, where there is a memorial healing camp. It'll be the 4th memorial for Bella Laboucan McLean, who came off the 31st floor of a downtown condo in Toronto, and where the family really wants more families who have experienced the same loss to come out and join them. And I was able to witness the ceremony in July and was just profoundly moved by how deep the restorative practice has been for people and the healing that they get from being on the land with grief therapists, with reconnecting just to true traditional activities and being held up by community. It was incredible, and we are committing to sending as many families that we can raise money to go to that. And we have a whole year to do it, so you'll be hearing more about that if you follow us on Facebook, No More Silence on Facebook, or on Twitter. Miigwech.
Which everyone should do. Let's see. We have a question over here. No? Okay, Heather?
Actually, on the tail of that, I actually wanted to ask everybody, even people in the audience, who I'm sure have lots of knowledge too, about sex work fitting into an inquiry. That I know that there is a lot of disagreement about the sex trade being a site of violence or a site of labor, and in terms of how to address Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans folks who are in the sex trade. So what are some of the perspectives you've heard, seen about how to bridge very, very differing perspectives about how to perhaps address sex work or the sex trade in terms of how that can play into missing and murdered Indigenous folks?
It's open call.
I think that it's important that leadership is taken from people doing that work. You know, just like I keep reiterating this inquiries about families, I don't think ever it's appropriate to, you know, purport to speak on someone's behalf. That's why we've gotten in all this trouble to begin with. People have their own voices, and it's complex, and, you know, there's lots going on. We saw it in Alex's presentation. And so to try and neatly, I think, wrap any of that up is very hard, and I wouldn't want to make the conversation disingenuous by trying to pretend those complexities aren't there. And so, you know, make people uncomfortable. That's the only way we ever create the space to think about things in new ways. And so, you know, I'm definitely not an expert in that way whatsoever, but I would try to support people who want to come forward to have those discussions and provide leadership on those issues.
Any other comments?
Okay, I can't hold my tongue
We
no
got
more.
Wanda over here. There you go.
I just can't hold my tongue no more. I can't help it. I got to say something. If my daughter was a sex worker, I would love her the same way if she was a lawyer. And, you know, I believe, you know, I mean, we as women have been suppressed and oppressed in a sexual nature since, well, long before I was born, and I was born a long time ago. Because, you know, we can't even talk about sex. It's all about that word. What's that word? Misogyny? Okay, so all about the men having a good time and the women having nothing. And like, so what happened about us having a good time? But not only that, I say that the sex trade work is the oldest profession in the world. And if those of us who are heterosexual and married to men, can we honestly say that we have done a sex act to be able to make sure we could go to bingo that night? Or get permission to go somewhere, right? I mean, okay, I readily admit it, right? You know, I didn't want to do it, but I knew I'd get to go to bingo if I did. Or I get a new winter coat. Or, you know, like he'd watch the kids for the evening, or maybe the Saturday morning, right? So I think we have to start talking about that. Isn't that sex work? I mean, you know, I was reading on Facebook about a woman who, charged her husband $20 every time she had sex with him. And when he lost his job when he was 60, she was a millionaire. And so she was able to support them into their retirement, right? I'm like, wow. If I had charged the men that I've slept with $20, like, I don't know, I would be probably living in some mansion right now instead of divorced 3 times. Well, 2 times. So I think it's important to have a dialogue that says sex work is fine. There's survival sex, there's, but don't stop loving them. I don't, and people who've been trafficked, I don't believe that either. Like, I want to kick his ass or her ass. Is putting our vulnerable children out on the street to be sex workers? Oh, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with somebody who's going to be forced into the sex trade. No. I believe we have to stand up for them and keep them safe. But for those who choose that kind of work and get a doctor's degree because they've been stripping and they don't have any student loans, I'd say that was pretty smart, right? Because they made good money while they were paying for an education that we should be getting for free. And who is it that goes to all the, no, I won't say that. Okay, I will. It's the men who go and spend the money at these places. And so, great, because they're contributing to women's welfare while they think they're not. So we know that they are, because, we eat with that money and we raise our children with the money that they pay. So, more power to you. And I think it's time we say that. We have to love them. And whatever it is, just respect where they're at. And, because if we don't, we're going to find them murdered and missing, and then what? Because it's your guilt you're going to have to live with if you've done something that you weren't happy with when something happens to your niece or your granddaughter. So I'd say just a red umbrella movement, If you get a red umbrella, it's because you can support them, right? But we still have to love them and not be afraid to talk about it and not get kicked out of the places that we're talking about it in.
I know I've said before in my advocacy that doesn't matter what a woman does to earn a living. It doesn't give her any less right to live. But I'm open to hearing from everybody else too. But I know that's my standard response to that topic.
I just want to make one more comment to the young lady that was back there and asked about what can communities do to be a part of this inquiry. And I think continue to have community conversations like this. Invite students, invite grandparents, invite the youth, invite the people that I think you want to educate and want to involve in the process. I think that's very important for us to continue to do as a community-based society. Thank you.
First, I want to say thank you to all the speakers for sharing your stories. I feel really moved by hearing them, and I guess I'm a bit emotional because some of them brought up some experiences I've had living in Vancouver in the Lower East Side, and some friends I lost there as well. So thank you for sharing. My question, though, is that as you talked about your experiences of healing and the processes of healing and what it takes to heal from loss and the kind of journey that is and the lifetime that it is, and I know a number of you spoke about the importance of the ongoing supports that communities and families are going to need through this process. I wonder if you have sort of frames of reference or models that you've seen be effective, or even ideas about what it looks like to help create or implement sustainable ongoing support through this process in communities that are often, quite remote and small and don't have really large populations. And we all know there's not going to be government funding for lots of resources for therapy or counseling, or certainly those things to come from traditional perspectives and Indigenous perspectives, because the government doesn't often support those initiatives. So I'd really be interested in hearing what your thoughts are about what it might look like to try to provide those kind of supports through the process.
I'm going to try to give a little bit of what I think might happen. I know when the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was funded, I think there were in the northern communities, there was more support from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. They had more mental health workers and things like that. But you know, when the funding is all of a sudden gone because you got a government that don't really care about people, they only care about the economy and things like that, that there was a real disintegration, I think, of services in some communities. I'm only speaking for the north because that's the only place I really know. And there are some communities, oh, sorry. I didn't want it in my face, but I guess it gotta be there. There are some communities that do have, like Nunatsiavut, for example, that region, we do have a lot of mental health services, I think, and but we still need more. And sometimes there are some things there that can be enhanced. So, and I don't know the answer, but I do know that, for example, Nunatsiavut has one of the highest suicide rates in Canada, period. And Nunavut, the whole Inuit homeland together, they've got I don't know if it's maybe 30% higher suicide rate than the rest of Canada, you know, so we obviously need services, that's for sure. So, and you know, I don't know when human lives, when it's going to matter, what's going to matter, more money or more human lives lost. And at some point, surely someone's going to take notice and say we need to put some resources in the communities. But like I said, I'm only talking about the north because really that's what I kind of know.
Any other comments from the panel? I know I heard a statistic not that long ago. I think First Nations peoples are three times, not 30%, but 3 times more likely to die by suicide than non-Indigenous Canadians, and that actually in the north, Inuit are 11 times more likely to die by suicide. Hi. No.
Hello. There we are. I just feel like all my spirits behind me are talking to me, and I needed to talk about the suicide thing, and then everybody up here was speaking about suicide, and I wanted to speak to Alex's note on suicide. So, my name's Jeffrey McNeil Seymour. I'm from Kamloops, Tayshiaquecum, in Kamloops in so-called British Columbia. I am currently co-authoring a piece through the Faculty of Nursing at the UBC with the McCreary Institute, and what the data that we've obtained from Two-Spirit youth living in British Columbia is that 34% of those youth Two-Spirit youth have committed or have attempted suicide at one point. And so we've been talking about strategies of what people can do, and so I don't know who's joining us from online, but I also want to speak to the other Indigenous people in the room here too, is the pieces that I've done from my own territory. Is I also did a research study looking at lived experiences of Two-Spirit people living in Kamloops, and so those are persons from the Kamloops Reserve, but also attending Thompson Rivers University. And so one of the biggest pieces that came forward is, again, just identifying that there's strong themes of racism and classism from within the queer community that have experienced, but also not having strong feelings of belongingness or having a strong understanding of space and place as a Secwepemc person, as a two-spirit person on the reserve. And so unanimously, all of my participants shared that visibility was one of the biggest pieces for them to be seen in ceremony, to be seen in powwow, or to be seen at community gatherings. And so I guess I'm sending out a challenge nationwide to ask that all of the, if the next time that you're at a powwow, find the floor man, go up to the floor man, bring up your tobacco and ask him for a two-spirit round dance to call in and acknowledge all the two-spirit people that are there, because we're there. We're there, we're walking around, we're working the booths, we're dancing out in that arena, we're holding up the community. So I think it's time to force an interruption in that high suicide rate that we're calling all of our Qaswelton and Secwepemc. Qaswelton is a family, so all of our family, we're asking for you to force that interruption, ask for that round dance. One of the other things that I witnessed at Merritt, which is about 45 minutes away from Kamloops, it's just a really small, what I'd call a redneck community. We had a cross dance where men and women swap regalia. But what I witnessed there was this also created a safe space for a trans-identified fancy dancer to come out into the space and be accepted and to be celebrated for who she is. So calling for these things at the powwow, it increases the visibility, and I think also will create stronger feelings of belongingness for two-spirit people as they come up, because we have a responsibility to look after those that are coming up from behind us. So, Kukstam. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor, or has anybody checked Twitter to see if there's any questions out there? Go ahead. I know, it's so the people at home can hear.
Very good. So essentially you mentioned Loretta Saunders, and personally I am Mi'kmaq, but that's something that I've faced all my life is you don't look Indian, you don't look Indian. So that's forced me to consider how I fit into those statistics should anything happen, or to my sisters, especially being urban, Newfoundland, St. John's specifically raised, and then having the education that I do. Like, what opinions do you have on countering that sort of sentiment that gets thrown at you and that level of erasure?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer, because I don't want to discount the lived reality of being someone who lives as a person of color in Canadian society. I have privilege everywhere I go. And the thing that's always bothered me is when I having a conversation in a cab with a cab driver. I remember in university when I was studying Aboriginal law, all of a sudden they'd say, "Oh, you're Native," as if only an Indigenous person could care about something like that. And so part of me wanted to say, no, I'm not, because I wanted to counter the idea, but then I didn't want to erase who I was as a person. And so I've negotiated with a lot of caution. I remember in law school, I joined the Aboriginal Law Students Association, and other people in the association basically didn't want me there. And I actually had to just come to it from a place of compassion. I could understand why they felt I didn't belong there. And the histories are so different across Canada, you couldn't pretend to take your experience in St. John's and then, go to Saskatchewan and have it mean the same thing. Like, there are very particular histories in Canada that have people, experiencing, internalized racism or other complexities of, constantly when the kind of space for indigeneity opens, the kind of first reaction is a fear of there's already no resources for the people that are here. And so that's a real kind of day-to-day reality of, but I don't get any, the narrative of, free education or blah, 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 blah. When the reality of the matter is we had Cindy Blackstock fight in the Human Rights Commission so that Indigenous children who are living on reserve could just get the same amount of resources that provincial governments are making available to children. I mean, I'd like to point out that's not been implemented. There are no changes under this government that's so interested in happy pictures. And so, you know, it's almost like not a personal experience, which is a weird way to respond to your question, but it's bigger than you, it's bigger than me, it's bigger than the person that doesn't want you there. And so I would just try to come from a place of compassion and listen and, you know, try and, in a gentle way, to someone who's challenging you, maybe coming from a place that isn't of love, to just try and open their heart to the love, because that's the truth of the matter. All we have at the end of the day is how we treat each other, and the kind of communities we want to live in is created by us. And so take hate, take ignorance, and turn it around, and open up a dialogue that talks about the kind of community you want to live in, and does that person want to be there too? Because you're interested in having them there with you. If that helps.
I would add also that, you know, Indigenous people come in all shades, shapes, sizes, genders, and the fact that you wouldn't be recognized, or that people insist upon not seeing Loretta Saunders as Indigenous, is a product of white supremacy. That's a product of systemic racism and misogyny and interconnection. So it's not your issue, it's society's issue that's creating that hierarchy and not seeing you as Indigenous.
Or you could say that I'm a Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, and you know, they make us lighter and brighter. Right? So, you know, and brighter means smarter, right? So you have to also say.
And I know I've been challenged on that before too, when I bring in presentations and discussions, and someone brings up that Loretta didn't appear Indigenous, but now she was raised in an Indigenous household. Her mother is visibly Indigenous, and she was raised with the same environment as anyone who is visibly Indigenous. And so she had that trust and that love in her heart to people that may or may not have opened her up to the violence she experienced, in my opinion. But now I'm not victim shaming whatsoever. But that's one of the things that I've talked about before, is she came from an Indigenous family, she was raised Indigenous, and the people that perpetrated this crime against her knew her and her family. They knew, you know. And I know when she went missing, originally she was reported by the media as being non-Indigenous, and her mother was actually relieved. She said, good, that means someone's going to look for my daughter, which is very hard truth to swallow, because she knew if people knew her daughter was Indigenous, they weren't going to look for her. That's a very difficult truth to swallow. And on the third day, when someone mentioned in the first paragraph of an article that she was white, but in the bottom paragraph of that same article mentioned she was Inuk, that tells me that reporter did not know what Inuk meant. And the fourth day, she was finally being reported as Indigenous. And the families reported that the level of involvement from law enforcement started to decline rapidly. And I think that's something that needs to really be talked about. As there's another woman here in Newfoundland, Labrador, who was murdered not long after Loretta. She was visibly Native. Her case has barely made a blip in the news. And shows so much systemic wrongs that are happening here. Any other comments besides mine? It's a lot to swallow. Any questions? I've got a question. I'm curious as we all listen to the different presentations. Do you guys have any questions of each other? Not to put you on the spot or anything. Well, I really appreciate everyone coming tonight. Last call for questions. We are coming up on 9:30. Okay. Well, I do want to mention that I'd really like to thank everyone for taking the time to come listen this evening. It's not always easy to listen to these topics. It's not always easy to know the truth. But once you know the truth, you have a responsibility to do something about it. So, Nakamik, Jineska Mudden, Walalio, Marcy, Kliko. Thank you.